Besan is, it works as an equity and anti-oppression trainer, and she's been doing this since 2018. This year she published a resource on anti-Palestinian racism, and maybe we could share that website with you all. And then she pivoted to devote her professional output towards tackling anti-Palestinian racism in tandem with other forms of oppression across Canada and beyond. David Mivasair didn't give me his bio, but he's a good friend from Hamilton. He's a rabbi with lots of years of experience and an active member of Independent Jewish Voices. He is frequently called on in our part of the country and across Canada to talk about anti-Semitism, although he says that's not his forte, anti-Zionism, Zionism. It's a helpful perspective because often we feel silenced by that accusation. And our online person is coming into us from, I think, Coquitlam, or somewhere in the Fraser Valley. Abbotsford. And his name is Ron Dart. He teaches in the Department of Political Science, Philosophy and Religious Studies at the University of the Fraser Valley in Abbotsford, BC. And among other things, Ron writes and lectures about Christian Zionism. And I noticed that he and I must be very similar in age. We both attended the University of Lethbridge in Alberta. Not that many of us did in those days. And he studied at UBC. Around the same time I was at the Vancouver School of Theology. And then he studied at McMaster in Hamilton, which is where I live. So we have all these intersections, and we've never met. But we welcome Ron to the panel. So the panel is going to, everyone's going to take about 10 minutes to talk about their area, and then we'll invite them to converse with one another. We'll have a rich conversation.
Thank you, Diane. I have to say, as a Palestinian, when I walk into a room and I see this many kefiyehs in one place, it's a strange and new sensation, but it's great, very appreciated. So I'd like to thank you all for showing that visual bit of solidarity. Hi, my name is Besan Zubi. I am Palestinian Canadian. I was born in Canada. Both my parents were born in the Holy Land. My mother is a Christian Palestinian. My father is a Muslim Palestinian. So there aren't that many interfaith marriages that happen, and it's actually not legal to have an interfaith marriage in Israel, and so they moved to Canada in the 1970s in order to be married and to have a family. So I was raised in Toronto and Ottawa, and I live in Waterloo right now. And actually, I was saying David was such a wonderful support. I ran for office a couple years ago, and he drove from Hamilton to Kitchener several times to help me with door knocking and just to show support and solidarity. I was the only Palestinian running in all of Canada during that election. So
it wasn't just to show solidarity, I wanted you to win.
I wanted to win too, but I didn't, and here I am. And so I am here to talk to you I could go on for hours and hours and hours on the subject of anti-Palestinian racism. I've been an equity and anti-racism trainer for several years, and I always felt this kind of deceit that I was doing because I was talking about all these different forms of oppression, but leaving out the very big one that affected me. After last year, that was no longer tenable for me to do. I couldn't just kind of talk about everything but the elephant in the room that was affecting my daily life. And so I pivoted to working full-time on anti-Palestinian racism. I published a resource called, it's www.antipalestinianracism.com. This resource is meant to be accessible. I formulated it in my head for young people and their parents to be able to self-advocate in that way. There's also another more official and policy-oriented definition called the Arab Canadian Lawyers Association's report on anti-Palestinian racism. That is also a really, really great resource to use, especially if you're looking for a policy or a definition that you can apply within an organization. Anti-Palestinian racism is similar to many other forms of oppression in that it actually isn't this kind of like innate understanding. There's goals there, and the goals are to silence Palestinian activism, to erase Palestinian identity, to normalize Palestinian suffering, and all of these things have, in my opinion, contributed to the fact that this genocide is still going on, that Palestinians are still being blamed for their own death, for their own slaughters, and that we don't have any kind of unified movement towards ending this, especially at the leadership level, government leadership level. So anti-Palestinian racism works in a lot of different ways, right? You've probably noticed many of them. So for example, it works to silence, invisibilize, and censor Palestinian voices. Like, even when there is a Palestinian perspective being presented, oftentimes it's not a Palestinian who is self-advocating. It is somebody else who is seen as safer and less controversial than a Palestinian who is given the opportunity to advocate on behalf of Palestinians. We also see systemic, oppression of Palestinians, whether that's from the entire media system kind of not allowing the word Palestine to be uttered on their channels like the CBC, to the government, where I have seen so many instances of the Prime Minister of Canada engaging in anti-Palestinian racism, and there are no resources available to Canadians to actually get accountability and to stop that. Recently there was a guidebook, or 2 days ago, a guidebook was released on the IHRA definition of antisemitism, which has been rejected by multiple universities, multiple organizations, because it serves to silence Palestinians specifically. I can't say that Israel is racist. Well, of course it's racist. Like, all the objective measures are there to match that criteria, but yet I would be liable to be called racist if I called Israel racist, right? So there are these kinds of idiosyncrasies that only make sense if you don't view Palestinian humanity as equal, right? That's the only way that this makes sense. There's also, obviously, the victim-terrorist binary that's applied to Palestinians. I get called terrorist. I'm a pretty soft girl. Like, I get called terrorist on a daily basis on social media. I get called violent. I get called, all of these things because I'm Palestinian. And when Palestinians are not terrorists, they are victims. Like, we can only be those two things. And so that's the human shield argument that gets posed against Palestinians. We're either violent and deserving of our pain and suffering, or we are victims of the violent and deserving of suffering Palestinians. And so that is how the Palestinian innocence is taken away from us. We are all guilty, we are all complicit in that way. Even children and babies are viewed as future terrorists, right? This is the way that schools and daycares and orphanages are justified as legitimate bombing targets in the genocide in Gaza. And then there's also the conflation with anti-Semitism. So I'm happy that Rabbi David is here, because that's really pernicious, especially as an anti-racist and somebody who works within anti-racist spaces. The allegation that I'm racist, coming from people who don't even self-identify as anti-racists, as committed to combating all forms of oppression, to work in solidarity with other people, is especially pernicious. In order to believe that Palestinian self-advocacy is inherently anti-Semitic, you have to believe that Palestinian and Jewish humanity are inherently at odds with one another. Like, that's the only way that that allegation can be understood within a coherent worldview. That Palestinian and Jewish humanity are at odds with each other is the only way you can understand that advocating for Palestinian humanity is anti-Semitic. And so understanding that, and understanding that there are no two people whose safety will come at the expense of another, is key to being able to see the interlocking nature of anti-Semitism and anti-Palestinian racism, and to actually work from an anti-oppression and anti-racist framework. So yes, of course, we cannot allow anti-Semitic kind of messaging or actions to at all be acceptable within an anti-Palestinian movement, or a pro-Palestinian movement. But the pro-Palestinian movement in and of itself is being called racist, is being called anti-Semitic. Wearing a keffiyeh, showing your pride for being Palestinian, is called anti-Semitic. These logically place Palestinian and Jewish humanity at odds with one another, and it has to be called out. So Diane asked me to talk a little bit about the Canadian context. One more thing I just wanted to say was, it's important to call out anti-Palestinian racism by name. A lot of times the urge is to conflate anti-Palestinian racism with anti-Arab racism and Islamophobia. This serves to further invisibilize and diminish Zionist Palestinian-specific identity. So first of all, not all Palestinians are Muslim. We are a diverse people. I have a Muslim father and a Christian mother. I kind of am agnostic floating, like I'm not really sure, but I'm still affected by anti-Palestinian racism. And so Islamophobia is not a concrete way of describing what I experience. And furthermore, it's markedly different, right? Nobody says Muslim people don't exist. Nobody says Yasser Arafat invented Muslim people in the 1960s, right? There are specific characteristics to anti-Palestinian racism that need to be understood. As well, anti-Arab discrimination, anti-Arab racism, things that people do to invisibilize Palestinians is to just call us Arabs, to say that there are all of these Arab countries that we should return to, when even if we don't have any kinds of connection to them, to say that Arabs living in 48 Palestine are actually just Israeli Arabs and not Palestinians, right? All of these kinds of mottos are used to erase the existence of Palestinians. And so that's why anti-Arab racism is still in itself not a complete understanding of what anti-Palestinian racism is and how it manifests. Yeah, great. I'll pass that on.
Okay, David.
Wow, thank you. I think I should just leave some time to absorb what Besan said before I start talking. How about, I'm going to ask you a question. You don't need to answer out loud, but answer it to yourself. Did Besan say anything that you hadn't heard before? Like what did she say that you might have learned something from?
It's the passion of what you said. I speak fast, I'm sorry.
A lot to say in a little time. Oh my God, so I want to add a little bit to the introduction that Diane gave for me, and that is that for almost my entire life, from the time I was a teenager until maybe 5 years ago, I was a really passionate liberal Zionist, meaning that I was very devoted in my life to being part of the whole project, the whole enterprise of creating and developing and sustaining the Jewish state of Israel. So much so that I went to live there and thought I'd stay there the whole rest of my life. I thought that's where I belong. I don't belong where I was born and my parents were born and my grandparents were born. That was just a historical accident. But I do belong there. And I'm just telling you something about me that I think you should see as part of my bona fides or my credentials to be able to talk about this. I'm 72 years old. I'm well into my 60s, maybe even my late 60s. I really was a Zionist with all my convictions, all my heart, all my soul, and all my might. That was me. And only in maybe the last 5 years have I come to understand, like, the real truth. It's very hard to even know, much less to put it into perspective and understand it with all of the kind of countervailing influences that we are subjected to. And now I'm very clearly an anti-Zionist, and I believe that the Jewish state of Israel should not exist. I think it should be actually done away with, abolished. It doesn't mean that anyone who lives there should be hurt or suffer, but a state, a political structure that favors one ethnic group over all others and gives them rights and privileges that no one else has access to should not exist. And to say that out loud in Canada has now become criminalized. What I just said out loud to you all is deemed to be hate speech. And if anyone here is listening and wants to, you literally could call the police and have them come and get me because I just committed the crimes of hate speech of saying that the state of Israel shouldn't exist. If I say any other state shouldn't exist, if I say Canada shouldn't exist, that's okay, that's protected by our sense of free speech. But it's not okay to say that the state of Israel shouldn't exist. That's deemed to be anti-Semitic hate speech. It's part of what Besan just referred to, was promulgated 2 days ago by our government of Canada. And that's like a directive to all levels of government, all kinds of institutions, universities, hospitals. I imagine even barber shops and Uber drivers are not allowed to say certain things. Among them, you can't, like Besan said, you can't say Israel's a racist society. That's illegal. That's hate speech, anti-Semitic hate speech. So if the topic here for this panel is racism, it's one kind of racism is to assume that somehow or another, all Jewish people everywhere are part of and identify with and need to be aligned with the state of Israel. And that to criticize the state of Israel is somehow hurting Jewish people here in Canada. That is a very racist concept. It's racist to think that all Jews, no matter what or who they are part of that, when actually, in fact, many of us are opposed to it. We're offended by it. We recognize that it's unjust. You know, many of us are devoted to defeating it and changing it. And that has always been true since the beginning of the Zionist idea. The great majority of Jews all over the world historically did not identify with Zionism, didn't participate in it. Jews who had to flee the Nazis and other places didn't mostly go to live in Palestine. They mostly went elsewhere, right? That's one reason why there's so many Jews in Canada, right? So I want to make a real strong case that to identify Jews everywhere with the state of Israel is itself racist, and to assume that Jews would be upset by criticism of Israel or pointing out the truth about Israel. That's racist. Let's see, I'm not paying attention to time. How much more time do I have? Couple minutes. So, I want to just say a little bit more about anti-Palestinian racism. I'm going to give you 2 real-life examples from my real life in the last 2 days. So one of them is, I was invited to speak at a large, prestigious United Church of Canada church in Toronto. And I was looking forward to speaking there next Sunday, November 10th. And 2 days ago, I got a call from the minister saying, like, well, that probably wouldn't be such a good idea because some people in the congregation might react a little negatively,
Yeah.
and that would upset me. She wanted to protect my feelings, so she had to cancel me. So no one in that church gets to hear from me about Palestine. They only get to hear from certain people who are chosen because their views already align with what those people believe. I would define that as anti-Palestinian racism. The minister of the church is being policed by people in her congregation so that she doesn't expose everyone to ideas that they haven't already adopted. They can't be challenged to even think about things. So that happened. That was, I think, on Thursday. What is today? No, it was more recent than that. Anyway, it doesn't matter. The other thing is just last night, I read the first chapter of Rashid Khalidi's recent book, 100-Year War on Palestine. I have been involved with Palestine, even though I didn't call it that, for about 40 years, and Israel for more than 50 years of my life. When I was in undergraduate school, I took university courses on the history and on the political science. Until I read the first chapter of Khalidi's book last night, I didn't know that the actual articles of the British mandate for Palestine, or over Palestine, written by the League of Nations, directed the mandate to specifically serve to set up a Jewish state. I didn't know that until last night. I didn't know that it never referenced the 96% of the people who lived there at the time who were Palestinian. It refers to them as non-Jews. They are the other people. And I'll just say there's like layers of anti-Palestinian racism. The fact that that could even happen, that the British Empire was somehow charged with a mandate over Palestine, that is so unjust and so racist. I'm going to expand on that in a moment. The fact that I didn't know what the details of that arrangement was or were until I read it in Khalidi's book last night. Why is that information withheld? Why is that not known? Why is that just, you're not allowed to know that unless Khalidi writes about it, and somehow I managed to get his book and read it. Normal people won't do that, right? I want to just say something else that he wrote about. As the British colonial powers divided up the Ottoman Empire, mainly being the French and the English, they actually created other countries. We know this. They created Iraq, they created Syria, they created Lebanon. Palestine still was an exception. They didn't do that there in Palestine. And the reason why, this just went dead. Anyway, the reason why was to make space for a Jewish nation state. So this is more than 100 years ago. And I think with the topic of this session being anti-Palestinian racism, I want to just name that. How much more time do I have? That's it. There's so much more to be said, so I'm glad we're all going to stick around and talk together. And thank you.
We'll have more time, but I want to give Ron a chance to speak because we invited Ron to talk about the impact of Christian Zionism. And I think for me, this is a fairly recent discovery because in the past I thought Christian Zionists were those crazy Americans evangelicals who believed in the end times and wanted, that everyone to go to Jerusalem and da-da-da. But I'm realizing how much my own theological formation at Vancouver School of Theology was actually a kind of liberal Christian Zionism. And I think that has infected a lot of ministers who, at least in my era, maybe it's changed. But Ron, would you like to speak?
Okay. was going to say greetings from the wet, wet coast. It's been pouring buckets here the last 3 or 4 days, and we're putting together our Noah's Ark, and we'll see where we shall float with all this rain continuing to come in and join us. It's 10 years actually since we hosted the first Challenging Christian Zionism event out here in the University of the Fraser Valley, where I've taught political science for 35 years. And so the 10-year celebration, university has been chatting about it, and they're putting on another big event a couple of weeks here as well. So we continue the story. I live in what's called the Bible Belt of BC, and Abbotsford is called the Buckle of the Bible Belt. So to be hosting these sort of events in Abbotsford and the Fraser Valley runs very much counter to a certain theological vision of the relationship of the Bible, the Jews, Israel, and often the Palestinians are quite invisible in that discussion. And so I'd like to just briefly read a quote. Somebody probably know the Jewish poet Leonard Cohen. He has a lovely, in Anthem, he says, "Now the wars, they will be fought again. The holy dove, she will be caught again. Bought and sold and bought again. The dove is never free. Ring the bells that still can ring. Forget your perfect offering. There is a crack in everything, and that is how the light gets in. And in many ways, you're the crack that is allowing the light to get in. So thank you very much for what you're doing." I think probably a good way to start, which is the Bible is one of those texts that has shaped Western civilization. It has had an impact on other cultures and civilizations. It has been foundational to religion, to politics, to the church. And so to be minimally literate in terms of understanding how our culture makes sense of the contemporary conflict, the Bible is foundational. And the main actor in the Bible are the Jews. And so hence, if we had been reading Indian epics like the Mahabharata or the Tao Te Ching, the Jews don't factor into that. But our major text, or the canonical text in the West, is the Bible. And hence, this is why we are in, to some degree, the position we are in today, because most people coming from a Christian tradition and a Jewish tradition and even a Muslim tradition, to some degree, honor the Bible. But the question is how is the text to be interpreted? And this is where the conflict has divided peoples within Judaism, within Christianity, and obviously with Islam, as it has attempted to interpret the Bible within its own understanding. And so the struggle we have in dealing with the Jewish, Israeli, Christian, Palestinian is we have an authoritative text that claims to speak for a people who are seen as chosen by God, and therefore to question those people, their understanding of themselves, is to question God. Now there's two wings that often, or two paths that often go from that. Within the conservative evangelical tradition, there is the sense, and can come up in Calvinism, charismatic movements, Pentecostalism. There's a variety of forms of Christianity. Where I live in the Fraser Valley, it's very dominant. And of course, these interpretations of the Bible get played out into politics and political parties as well. So what goes on in terms of reading and interpreting the text then gets applied to political parties, and it can be the Conservative Party or the Liberal Party. And I'll touch lightly on this as I go along. I realize I only have 10 minutes, and this is a library of information to cover, and how I just feel like I'm like a stone skimming the surface of the water. And each of these topics are like large rooms in a massive house. And so there's doors going between the rooms from the text, the Bible, to the tradition of how it's interpreted, and then how it's applied to political parties, and then the impact on Canadian foreign policy in regards to Israel and the Jews and the Palestinians, whether in Gaza or West Bank or East Jerusalem, the refugee camps, the diaspora. But what's happened, so there are, as I mentioned, there are two aspects to interpret in the Bible. And Diane has mentioned that there has been a tradition, certainly since World War II and the Holocaust, of potential ministers. They can be united, they can be Presbyterian, Anglican, elements of Roman Catholic, and certainly free church types that are doing rethinks of how one is to read, say, St. Paul's chapter in Romans 9 to 11, our understanding of the Jews. And one tradition has been that with the coming of Christ, the Jewish tradition was seen as to some degree replaced, honored, left behind. But with this revisionist read post-World War II, and we find it very significant, exegetes and theologians like Kirstel Stendel, who became bishop in Sweden, Paul van Buren, an Episcopal priest, Diane is engaged, very important exegete at Vancouver School of Theology, and they all in their different way argued, and these are not conservative evangelicals, charismatic, reformed types. In fact, they argue that the Jews continue to have a legitimate role within an understanding of the unfolding mystery of God, and the return of the Jews to Israel is to some degree part of rethinking how you read Paul's understanding of the tree and the branches of Judaism itself. Therefore, to critique the Jews and Israel is to critique a text which most people of faith see as sacred. So rather than just the conservative evangelical, the end times, the return of the Jews to Israel as a fulfillment of prophecy, in fact, one of the leading people in Canada who was a part of that, again, is spending their latter days in Abbotsford, Mervyn Merla Watson. They began in the 1960s at St. Paul's in Toronto. Their music, they were part of the founding of the Christian Embassy in Jerusalem. So very important to know. There's also been other significant United Church theologians that are very much considered significant in the shaping and the forming of their theology, like Douglas John Hall, who has really said nothing about the Jewish-Palestinian issue. And you wonder why someone who's held so high and speaks at so many seminaries has really said nothing about this, and yet he's held high in terms of one of the preeminent theologians. I know my time is running out. I'll just say one more comment. There's so much I could say. It's just like getting the key in the ignition here. But one of our former prime ministers, Lester Pearson, who was a part of the United Nations Special Commission on Palestine, he was the one who chaired the commission that brought into being Israel in 1948. But his father was a Methodist minister. He grew up in the United Church, and he said, and this goes back to perhaps my first point on how the Bible is so influential on many people. He said growing up he knew more about Dan to Beersheba than he did from Victoria to Charlottetown in Canada. So as a young man, his very thinking was shaped by a certain understanding of the Bible as applied to the Jews. And then he takes a formal role in terms of the establishment of Israel in 48. And so, and of course, our two political parties, the conservative one, if they were to come into power, they have a pretty significant Zionist in terms of a deputy leader. Some of you know Melissa Lantzman there, and Trudeau has been very weak again on Israel, Palestinians, given the fact his fundraiser comes from the wealthy Bronfman family, Stephen Bronfman, and so he grew up in the very wealthy Montreal, part of Montreal as well. But I think it's time to pull back a bit here because I've been given 10 minutes and I know I'm skating in all sorts of directions and there's so much that could be said on both the biblical, the traditional, the political, and then the implications for Palestinians in Israel at the present time. So I shall bid you au revoir, and I suppose it's Q&A time.
So, can I ask you a question, Besan? How do you think that racism plays, what role does it play in the genocide that's happening?
That's outside of my technical expertise. I mean, it perpetuates it, right? It normalizes it. We see images of Palestinians and they're sensationalized, but they're also lacking context. Even before, what started happening in Gaza last year, I have been talking about this kind of nameless, faceless Palestinian woman, like this image of a woman, she's wearing hijab, she's crying, she's screaming, she's in front of rubble. But we don't know her name, we don't know why she's crying, we don't know what happened to her, we don't know her loss. And these kinds of images, these sensationalized images of Palestinians were the norm. It's either a man, like a violent man, he's a militant, he's that, or this is this woman, this faceless, voiceless woman who has no agency, who has no background story. She's not interviewed. We didn't ask her any questions. We're not saying exactly what happened to her. We're just seeing this kind of perpetual suffering. And so when you have that as the context of Palestinian kind of understanding within the West, that Palestinians are just perpetual sufferers or perpetual fighters, you are able to kind of normalize what you're seeing happening in Gaza day in, day out. We've been primed for this for many, many years. So when this started happening, of course, I'm seeing so much more Palestinian solidarity than I've ever seen before, and that's somewhat encouraging, but it hasn't really changed very much, has it, right? Like, we haven't been able to actually affect that much concrete material change. People are still dying at the same astounding rate that they have been this entire time. Like, nothing has kind of ever like slowed down or ever kind of changed. And so, of course, this kind of media representation of Palestinians, this kind of dehumanization of Palestinians has primed us to allow for this genocide to go unabated, to go unquestioned by people in power. I also think that because of the silencing and censorship of Palestinians, we're not allowed to even fight back, right? Like that has also taken a lot of work to create. Like the IHRA definition didn't start last year. This has been decades in the making, right? This definition was actually not created to be applied within an anti-racist human lens. It was made by a man who wanted to create a web program to be able to identify online instances of anti-Semitism. Like the context of this definition is not for application to political speech, it's not for application to human rights advocacy at all. It's not built to be anti-racist. And the drafter of this definition has spoken out against it. He says, I don't like the way this definition has been used, I don't approve of it, but he's not being listened to. Because we have a tool now that is able to further silence dissent in Palestinian voices, right? So all of that is not new, and that has been built up for a really, really long time because the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians from their homeland has been going on for a really, really long time. Without that kind of context, it's really impossible. Like, you would think this would have stopped by now, right? Like, you would think that there would be mechanisms for there to be some kind of international intervention, some kind of, the International Criminal Court, like something like that would have, taken a little bit more of a powerful position against this. But because anti-Palestinian racism has been allowed to spread unfettered for so long, because we didn't really have a name for it before 10 years ago, one of the earliest works on anti-Palestinian racism, naming it, was written by Leila Abu-Lugod in, I think, 2015, and that's really one of the first academic references to naming and kind of framing anti-Palestinian racism. So all of this has kind of led to where we are today, where it's so normal to silence Palestinians, where Palestinian suffering is seen as a natural and unavoidable, and where Palestinian humanity is seen as something that's controversial, right? Like, I've literally told people I'm Palestinian and had the response be, oh, that's so controversial. I didn't know my birth was controversial. And so all of that has just been manifesting for a really, really long time. So to think about this outside of the context is not kind of going to get you to the framework or the context that you need to understand why this is still going on and actually what is demanded of us in order to stop it from going on, which is naming this, demanding change, demanding action on this issue, and not just kind of placing what's happening in Gaza as like this unique and uncomfortable event, so much as the continuation of a longstanding policy that needs to end and change, right? Yeah.
One of the organizations that I also belong to is CJPME, and they have a media team. So if you read something in the paper that you recognize as anti-Palestinian racism or as a really slanted, biased piece, you put up a flag and people write letters to the editor to protest, or sometimes to give applause if it's a positive, like if it's well done. So that's an option for people, a way to act if you're not able to go out and protest every day. David, sometimes I'm surprised and shocked at the racism I see by Israelis. I don't know what your take on that is.
So I'm also just shocked by just extreme dehumanization of Palestinians by Israelis. I think it's very widespread. I'll just remind everyone I lived in Israel for 4 years. I've gone there many times since then. I pretty much read Israeli media every day, and I think the dehumanization of Palestinians by Israelis is just pervasive. It's almost universal. So, yeah, it's like I'm not even sure what to say about it. I mean, some thoughts I have are that it comes from a kind of indoctrination that Israelis are subjected to or exposed to, and many other Jews are, and many other people are. That comes from such a focus on the history of Jews being dehumanized, and Jews being disempowered, and Jews being victimized, through centuries and centuries, and culminating in the Holocaust. And that is such a central feature of like the education system in Israel, and self-awareness, what it is to be a Jew. That's like such a central focus of it. And I think that is very intentional. First of all, I'll say it's all true. That's actually really true history. But it doesn't need to be given the emphasis that it has. And it's instrumentalized. It's used to promote a sense of entitlement and a sense of empowerment, and to kind of justify what Israel and Zionism have done and continue to do, and think they need to continue to do into the future to the Palestinians. And Diane, when you asked the question, I'm not sure what you want me to address, but I think first I'm saying I think what you're seeing is real. It's true. And I've seen that over and over and over. Hold on a second. Second thing I want to say is where I think it comes from. And I think it's completely wrong. It needs to be countered. It needs to be named and pushed back against. And I think ultimately, it's just absolutely horrible. It's a story that I've told, it fits into this. When I first went to Israel as a 19-year-old, I remember walking down the street in Jerusalem, maybe the second day I was there, and there was a little boy, and I could tell he was a little Arab boy, maybe 6 or 7 years old. He had a cut on his hand, and his hand was bleeding, and he was crying. And there were 2 policemen standing right nearby. And I went to the police. I took the little boy, I said, come with me. I went to the police, and in my very rudimentary Hebrew, I said to the police, help this boy. And I remember they just said to me, wow, what are you talking about? He's an Arab, get rid of him, get him out of here. And that was it. That was like part of my first exposure to, you call it anti-Palestinian racism or dehumanization or just whatever that was. And as I said before, I think it's virtually pervasive in almost every aspect of Israeli Jewish society, and also outside of Israel in so much of the Jewish society that identifies with Israel. And just, I think we do have to work against that. Thank you.
I wonder if there are any questions from the audience, and particularly if someone has a question for Ron to start.
I have a question.
Does anyone have a question for Ron? How the war on terror has framed the way we understand.
People can be called terrorists.
And people can be called terrorists.
Yeah, a superb question, so thank you. There's a wonderful story told by Augustine in The City of God that Noam Chomsky often quotes, which is unusual for Chomsky to quote Augustine in The City of God, but in that particular quote passage is the story of Alexander the Great sailing the Mediterranean, and he encircles these pirates, and he insists that the pirate come on the ship. And he says, "What right do you have to infest the seas and terrorize people?" Pirate looks at Alexander and he says, "What right do you have to infest the world? You get called an emperor." And I think the language of terrorism is used in a very selective and contradictory manner. And so when people are terrorized and they fight back, they're often called the terrorists. Meanwhile, they have been terrorizing people for decades. And so really the history of the Israeli treatment of the Palestinians is again and again isolating them, ghettoizing them, terrorizing, using violence against them in the name of the state, and never again, and Holocaust story. But in fact, when the Palestinians fight back, whether it's Hamas, Hezbollah, or others, they're called the terrorists. And so it's a real distortion of language to call one people terrorists. It's like if you put your foot on someone's head and keep squishing it to the ground, they fight back, they're called the problem. When in fact the other person who's been creating the problem is excused by those who dare to fight back. So this war on terror, violence, one really has to get a sense of who's been terrorizing who. When those who are in the minority fight back, they're called the terrorists. A total distortion of how language is used to justify powerful terror itself, state terror in that sense. And then the American support of that, and then of course Hamas and Hezbollah are called the terrorists. Meanwhile, millions of dollars are going to Israel to terrorize the Palestinians. I don't know, hope that makes sense in some small introductory sort of way.
Yeah, thank you. Jafar, you have a question?
Yes.
And maybe you can give...
I have a loud voice. I think I can...
Okay. I mean, thank you for what you said. I have a personal question, I think. What made you change your mind? I mean, 50 years as a Zionist is not a holiday. And I am sure that your time in Israel, you stayed at a settlement or a colony. And you've had the experience that we as Palestinians could only dream of. What happened to make you change your mind? And how, I mean, I'm quite sure you are using this to advocate for Palestinian, justice. But what do you think from a Jewish background that could, what work could you do to influence more people to become advocate for the cause? And how are you tackling what happened with the IHRA 2 days ago? What are you doing to tackle this? And if I may, just a quick last question. I mean, it's you know, when you are denied to speak at the church as a Christian, this annoys me. Sorry? I know I am a Christian.
Oh, as a Christian.
As a Christian, this annoys me. How, if you will, do you plan to attack such a thing?
Okay, so we just got the program for the next hour. I have 2 minutes. Okay, so first question, what made me change my mind about Zionism? And in all seriousness, it was a very long, slow, incremental process. I already told you when I was 19 years old, in my first 2 days that I was in Israel or in Jerusalem, or now I can say I was, to tell you the truth, I wasn't in Palestine. I was in Israel in my head. But what I want to say is, I saw right before my eyes, in the most concrete terms, exactly how the problem manifests. And it did take me perhaps another 45 years to overcome my own cognitive dissonance in wanting to believe, like, my people are good. What we do is good, right? Our Jewish stories and Jewish mythology, that's all good. So, and I had a very strong emotional attachment to that, right? It was part of my identity, of myself. Who am I? What am I in this world? I'm part of that, and it's good. And right before my eyes, I could see what contradicted that. And I'm just telling, my answer to your question is, for me, it took a very, very, very long time to reevaluate and ultimately reject the stories that I adopted to tell myself that helped me define who I am in the world. You know, so that's like a big general statement to you. And then very specifically, I saw more and more and more and more, and you said I must have spent time in, you know, settlements. Yes, I could tell you so many things I saw for years and years that were horrible. And that's why maybe I was a liberal Zionist or a progressive Zionist. But to finally give up being a Zionist at all, it took that long. And I want to hold that out to everyone here as actually a sign of hope, not to give up on anybody, regardless of how committed and how convicted and how thoroughly indoctrinated they are. Don't give up on them. They may be worth talking with. They may be worth suggesting that they read something or, you know, engage with them. Don't give up on them. And in great rabbinic tradition in the Talmud, it says the gates of repentance are never closed. The gates of repentance are always open, no matter like how bad a sinner you are and how long you've been a sinner. God doesn't close the gates of repentance. And I mean that metaphorically, but very seriously. Don't give up on people who you may be trying to have some relationship with. And then very specifically, something I know pushed me was reading Ilan Pappé's book, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, that so thoroughly contradicted my own myths that I adopted, even though I lived there and I saw it with my own eyes. Somehow I had to read it in a book. I had to read it in a book written by an Israeli, not a book written by a Palestinian, which I never would have even read, right? For me to read Rashid Khalidi is like kind of another step. I told you I read things last night that I'd never even heard before. Two other books that really moved me were also written by an Israeli professor. One is called The Invention of the Jewish People, that again contradicted so much of my fundamental outlook on life. And it wasn't easy to overcome that, but hey, like I read the book, it's like, no, I can't actually argue with that. I think it's right. The guy's a professor at Tel Aviv University. And then the book he wrote subsequent to that was called The Invention of the Land of Israel. That even there is such a thing as the land of Israel. Where did that concept even come from? Right? And again, that was like a fundamental underpinning of my worldview. And when I read that book, it kind of forced me to shift. So, and then You asked what am I doing about the IHRA. So anybody that wants to know, I encourage you. I can't talk about it, my time's run out already, but I am a member of Independent Jewish Voices Canada, and Independent Jewish Voices Canada, together with the Jewish Faculty Network and the United Jewish People's Order, put on our website yesterday a statement outlining why it's wrong. And I've been part of our working group fighting against it for years, I mean literally. And we are up against absolutely overwhelming forces that are so hard, to push back against, but we're doing that. Then you asked one more thing. Did I get it all? What's that?
The church.
Oh, yeah, I don't want to be flippant, but that's not my fight. You, Palestinian Christian, if you want, I'll tell you the name of the church and the minister. I didn't want to expose that in public. You all do that work. You are UNJPPI. That's your job. You do that, And yeah, that's the work. I have my own battles to fight, which are in the Jewish world. We're all in it together, but let's, be clear, where, and I'm, actually I do want to talk with Diane and others. They know who I'm talking about. Should I call that minister back and see if she wants to have coffee with me sometime? You know what I'm saying? Am I done with her, or am I not? And just another thing I want to say, another thing that wasn't said in my little biography, I was a congregational rabbi. I was like the pastor of synagogues for 25 years. From that point of view, I know the conundrum that a pastor of a congregation faces when, I'll just say, powerful people in the congregation have very strong ideas about something, and the pastor themselves doesn't think that's really the right way. If you want to keep your job. 2, you want your congregation to stay together. You don't want them to be in conflict with each other. So immediately in that conversation with the minister, I said to her, I understand, what you are dealing with as the minister in that congregation, and I wouldn't be in judgment of her. If I was in judgment of her, my judgment is she actually did the right thing for her church at this time. And there's other work that needs to go on inside that congregation to deal with the dynamics and the issues there before you can bop them over the head by bringing me in as a speaker on a Sunday morning. Because that's not going to work. It'll backfire. It'll be problematic. And for the sake of the church, I wouldn't she got it. They're not ready for that. So still, I think, that's why you're all here. That's what UNJPPI is completely about. That's why UNJPPI exists, is to do that work within the United Church of Canada. And, God bless you. That's why I'm here to support you.
Thank you. Thank you, Besan and Ron and David, for just giving us a taste of this conversation. We really appreciate your coming.